been a home brewer for more than 30 years, making many award-winning beers. When we moved to our new home at the Overlook, I was determined to continue with this hobby, but I couldn't possibly fit all the equipment into our apartment. I mentioned the possibility of starting a homebrew club at the Overlook, and both marketing and management were intrigued with the idea, but the challenge was to find an appropriate and safe brewing location on the campus. Undaunted, I enlisted the aid of facilities manager Robert Bucknell and activities director Joanne Brackett to find just the right location. Management gave us the approval to use some space on the first floor of the admin building for our storage and use. Regulations required propane to be used outside, so we used a nearby shed previously designated for smoking. I spent weeks cleaning all the areas to make them suitable for sanitary brewing. With management on board and a brewing area secured, now my job was to develop enough interest among the residents. I scheduled a beer sampling and related slide presentation, which was attended by more than 64 residents. This was enough to generate interest in starting a club. I named it the Overlook Brew Crew. Shortly after, we created our first beer, a German wheat or Hefeweizen, which was a huge success. Since then, the Brew Crew has doubled in size and we have brewed several more styles. We call our beers Senior Moment. As we like to say, I just had a senior moment and I enjoyed it.
Brew day begins at 5:30 a.m. Any of the brew crew members arriving at that hour are put to work helping to move the equipment and supplies out to the brewing shed. When that's done, it's time to get the grain measured and prepared.
And once you pull the wrong string.
Malted barley is the main source of the sugars that are fermented into beer. The barley is soaked in water for a couple of days and then air dried, allowing it to sprout. Kiln drying stops the sprouting process. The dried barley is full of sugar, starch, and enzymes that the brewer uses to control the body, color, and alcohol content of the beer. This is barley right out of the bag. You can see some of the tiny sprouts. And here's the crushed grain after milling. This may be a good time for a quick course in brewing. It won't take long and there is no test. The tank on the right, called the sparge tank, holds filtered water and a small amount of chemicals that will enhance the style of beer being brewed. The gas flame under the tank is lit to heat the water. While that's heating, about 25 pounds of grain is added to the middle tank, called the mash tun. A screen keeps the grain from settling to the bottom of the tank. When the water is up to temperature, valves are released to let gravity fill the mash tun. When the level in both tanks is equal, a different set of valves are turned. More water from the sparge tank is pumped in to cover the grain. The pump and heater run constantly, keeping the water flowing down through the mash. This releases the sugars and flavors from the grain. Depending on the style of beer being made, this infusion takes between 1 and 2 hours. When that's done, the wort is drained from the mash tun into the boil kettle. At the same time, more sparge water is pumped into the mash tun. It filters through the grain and takes all the sugars with it. The gas under the kettle is lit and the wort boils for up to 2 hours. Hops are added at various times through the boil, depending on the flavors and bitterness the brewer wants to add. Once the grain is in the mash tun and infusion starts, Steve's job is to watch the time and temperature. Sometimes, but not very often, he sits down. Mostly he's happy to have the brew crew and anyone else stop by and keep him company. He's eager to answer questions and teach us all about beer.
How you doing? Oh, Jesus.
It's just about breakfast time now, and more of the brew crew wander over to watch and talk. Overlook employees on their way to work stop for a minute and sometimes take pictures. There's as much social time involved in the making of beer as there is sitting around and drinking it.
How are you?
Right, okay. So you still see it's brown. Not quite as dark as it was before. That's something.
At the end of the boil, hops are added to the kettle. Hops, which come in dozens of varieties, are the flower of the hop plant and are bought dried. When they're growing, they look a bit like little pine cones. When boiling time ends, the wort has to be filtered from the hops, drained from the kettle, and cooled quickly. Everything that comes into contact with the wort when it's below boiling temperature has to be sanitized to minimize bacteria. It also prevents naturally occurring yeasts from ruining the flavor of the beer. We use a plate chiller to get the boiling liquid down to room temperature. Cold water chills metal plates inside the chiller, while the wort circulates around them. The heated water exits through one side, while the cooled wort leaves the other. A small pump fills the carboys. Six-gallon plastic carboys are used to transfer the wort to the fermenter inside the building. We're fortunate that Steve is younger than most of us and can heft that 50 pounds of liquid in these hard-to-hold jugs, especially with everyone watching. The wort is aerated as it splashes into the fermenter. For this brew, we're adding a liquid yeast. Once it is stirred into the wort, fermenting begins, and we can now call it beer. A one-way valve on top of the fermenter lets carbon dioxide out without letting any air in. The brew day that started at 5:30 this morning isn't over yet. The equipment has to be taken apart and cleaned. Spent grain will go to the compost pile in the garden.
I'll take care of that after. The inside.
It's about 3 in the afternoon before everything is put away. 10 days later, the brew crew gets together to bottle our beer. First, the bottles have to be washed.
bottom of the bottle. I like that.
The fermenter is opened and the beer is transferred to the sanitized carboys to move them to the bottling area. The bottles that were washed this morning are sanitized. The draining racks are modified shoe racks, an idea that came from Steve's wife, Dolores. Bill's reward for sanitizing bottles was a taste of the beer. Bottling a batch of beer is another social activity for the brew crew. Just about everybody had a chance to try all the jobs in the assembly line.
Bottling day.
Bottling day.
Beer bottling day.
And then D
Yes.
Day is coming. Drinking day. Yes.
The hops over the hill.
Hops are over the hill, the compost pile. I need light, so the light comes down, goes through the bottle and shows me the level. And I push down, and notice it starts flowing. Take it away directly.
This is just plain fun.
We haven't come yet.
That's a lunatic.
My weight on top of it.
That's right. We get it in the bottle.
Yep.
How many bottles are there?
Didn't go on.
At 110.
How's that look?
Okay, it looks okay side to side. Looks pretty good. It looks okay side to side. I think this will work fine. I think you're right on.
A little bit. Softly. Okay.
We'll try it.
It's gotta go this way.
Yeah, it's,
Toward me?
Yeah.
No, not that way.
Yeah.
Now you got another one to do?
got another one. You ready?
Ready.
That's a wet towel.
All wet. They're all wet.
Someone's running.
Have to find the perfect lid. There you go.
I think I have the job which goes per bottle.
Going in bottles. It's not really ready to drink, so it is going in bottles.
Gee, can't even get a hat on straight and he's gonna do that?
Well, you know, I didn't realize that when we started, but
Then I have to hold it somehow.
he's learned how to put a cap on straight anyway. I don't know about his head.
Oh, it comes out, the cap's still on.
I can do it.
Oh, I'm down now. Okay, how's the rest of it? There. Hey, how about inside?
There's some between the two.
Yeah.
Okay, Jack.
What about that dripping?
I'll make sure I won't do it.
That's okay. Before we waste the beer.
It's all right.
Okay.
Okay, pull it towards you. Yeah, okay.
Hurry up, Bill, you're slipping behind.
Sweetheart. Take it easy.
He really doesn't mean to.
Never thought we'd fill all those bottles. Holy
You
cow.
know you talked me into this, don't you? I'm not saying any names here.
Get out, Peter. Alright, that's not gonna work.
Making sure?
Here it comes, here it comes.
Oh, there it goes.
Once this here comes.
That bottle's already been rinsed off.
Yes, yes,
With
Peter,
beer.
that's right.
Yeah. Well, this would be about 1 ounce short.
You want to cap it?
Yes.
That's probably one that I'll wind up with.
No, that's one of our sample bottles.
Just make, see what's on.
Yeah.
If I had known that, but we made like extra towels and extra rice. I don't try to talk her into it.
I heard that one.
Get more pepper.
I'm gonna try it.
Bob's want to do this? This is great. I'm impressed with our efficiency and our camaraderie and our friendship and our good looks. What? Your turn. You're right.
This is a wonderful,
It was
this is
enjoyable.
a wonderful thing.
Thank you. Get paid now or later?
Yeah, right.
But we had about 11 3/4 gallons.
Well, how many
Wasn't
members
bad.
do we have?
We are up to 35 now.
35.
35.
So that 105 take 3 bottles apiece.
We
There's
have
12 bottles extra.
12 bottles extra.
1, 2.
No. They're for
I like the way
samples.
you think.
Now what we do is we get the brew crew together and we sample using the 12 sample bottles. That way you have your 3 and you don't have to open it until...
That sounds fair.
Yeah, that's the way to do
But
it.
there won't be 100. There won't be that many.
There won't be 112 because we're going to be sampling.
Right, that's what I mean. How about Dolores? You know.
No, that's it. That's the key. Luckily, she doesn't like porters.
Oh.
Oh, she doesn't?
Yeah, but you do. So.
5 weeks later, we got together again to label our bottles.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, once you start to get the...
Bringing some paper along with the...
Here comes the quality inspector.
Don't need 2, do we?
I wasn't doing it right, so I got fired.
Oh. Elect on employment or something? Yeah.
Okay, we put on one upside down.
Okay,
Look good.
I want to see everybody's resumes because they can list all of the jobs that they did while working on the brew crew.
There you go.
Oh, okay. In case I need to go out and start working again.
Nice.
Last one. Stuck.
Share one with Johnny.
The labeling crew gets its reward, a first taste of the beer.
You take a sip, swish it all around in your mouth, and get your mouth accustomed. Don't even taste it, and then swallow it. The second taste, you will get a much more better, a better feeling or taste or whatever. So try that. Your first sip is going to be whoosh it around in your mouth and then swallow it. And then your second one, sip it like you would normally sip a glass of wine. Okay?
Now comes the time we've all been waiting for, a tasting, and then each of the 35 members gets their 3 bottles to take home.
Show the label.
Can't show the label, it's behind my hand.
So I don't get this.
Great.